All right, everybody, this lesson is going to cover the new civilization in Western Europe, which is chapter 10 in our textbook. And what we see is it's kind of broken into three phases, where we have a retraction phase, a reaction phase, and then a rebirth phase. And what we're dealing with here is the Middle Ages. So the retraction part is where, right after the Roman Empire has collapsed, life kind of reverts to a very primitive form of life, almost Neolithic. Instead of the big cities with large populations, it becomes small villages with mud huts and a small number of people. Subsistence farming is the name of the game. They band together only so that they can try to defend themselves, and that's where we see the keeps in the castles come into play, and this comes into play in the manorial system with feudalism, which is my micro lesson video you should have seen by now. Then the reaction phase is once they finally have achieved safety, security, and stability to some degree, they react by creating new institutions, and this mainly comes into play with the monarchy. And then we have a rebirth, which literally means, in what we see at the end, Renaissance, which means literally rebirth, and it's a rebirth of not just the Greek and the Roman culture, but really a rebirth of stability. So here's the timeline that we're looking at, and it's roughly how it's broken up, with the Dark Ages being the retraction period. And people often call it the Dark Ages because there's an assumption there was nothing intellectual happening. Whereas that's not actually the case. Really, Dark Ages, what you can think of is it's just a bad time. It's dangerous. Life is short. It's just not a good time to be living in Europe. Then the early and high Middle Ages are really what we probably most associate with medieval times, the castles, the kings, the queens, the lords, the ladies, the knights, and all that. We have the Crusades in there in the interim, and then we end up with the period kind of comes to a close with the Black Death, giving way to the Renaissance shortly thereafter, which is kind of remarkable that we go from one of the probably the worst, if not one of the worst, disasters in human history, natural disasters in human history, that about 100 years later gives way to one of the greatest intellectual and artistic growth periods in human history. Now, I'm going to skip the Crash Course World History videos because you guys can watch those on your own on the World History Crash Course YouTube channel. And I'm going to start by talking about the chaos. I've already mentioned briefly about the barbarians, the different Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Huns that had some to do with the destruction of the Romans, the Vandals, all these different barbarians that also later on give way to people like the Vikings. And that results in a necessity for this. When you have no safety, security, or stability, you try to find it however you can. And building walls around a big stone building is a pretty good way to keep yourself safe from maces and axes and swords of barbarians. But it's very slow growth. Those are the castles that you're used to would be more of the later Middle Ages, whereas early on it would be a mound of dirt on like a hill pretty much with wooden walls. Very kind of primitive. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of trouble. I'm going to skip this. That's something you can watch on your own in the notes. And what we see is, unlike some of the previous invasions of nomadic people, they don't just hit and then leave. A lot of times what we see happen is they end up staying, like with the Franks, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths. They kind of stake out their own kingdoms in the remnants of the Roman Empire. As we've already seen with Chapter 9, Byzantium is still standing, the Eastern Roman Empire. And this is what the map looks like for Western Europe. They're looking for their three S's, and the main way they find it is in religion. When you can't count on any sort of government help the way you did with the Roman Empire, when you can't count on any sort of economic stability the way you could with the Roman army protecting roads and the outposts, when you don't have any sort of social stability because you're either poor or a landowner, and that's it, what you can count on is your religion. And so the church has massive leaps in power and influence during the Middle Ages. From the local level with the priests all the way up to the capital city level of the Pope. So it's a social structure very similar to what we see in every other society, where you would have the peasants, the merchants, artisans, the landlords, and then the emperor. It's a similar social structure, but only this is in religion. And this is the system, the ism of the Middle Ages, feudalism. Feudalism, as you can notice on the first part of the word, feud. And it really kind of boils down to fighting. You want to have your stability, and so you have to protect yourself from the invaders who want to fight you, but also you have to protect yourself from other people that want to take the land that you have for the resources that you can produce. And so it starts with the king giving his land, or breaking up his land, into parcels and chunks, like I discussed in the manorialism, with fiefs. And the fief is given to a landlord, which gives you some idea as to where that term comes from, who then breaks it up into smaller parcels that are controlled by knights who are his soldiers that come into duty and service whenever he needs it. And I'm not going to show you this. This is a clip from Monty Python. You can watch it yourself. Very funny about the king. And it's all worked by the people who are producing everything, the peasants. Basically, feudalism, if you need to write the definition, which you do, but if you want to have a simple definition, it would be land in exchange for military service. Military service is an obligation. The lord has obligations to his vassal. The vassal has obligations to his lord. Skipping that as well. In a sense, it's its own social structure, but it's also sort of like what we saw with the caste system. It kind of covers everything: political, economic, religious, social, because everybody has a place and everybody has a role to play and obligations and duties, sort of like dharma in Hinduism. Manorialism I've already discussed. I'm not going to discuss it further here. And this is evidence of why the achievements of the Dark Ages show that we should not call it Dark Ages for lack of intellectual accomplishments. Because what we do see is the 3-field rotation system I've already discussed. That's quite an innovation. They develop a new plow, for which you will be responsible for knowing. Make sure you figure out what that is. I'm not going to tell you here. That's something that you will need to know. They have new ways of developing spinning thread so they can make cloth textiles easier. They have water wheels, which they use the power of water to turn the wheels so that they can grind grain easier, which aids in food production. Clocks, mechanical clocks. This is the famous one in London. And the university is something that's developed. One of the oldest universities in the world, the University of Paris or Oxford, both of those developed in this Middle Age, supposed Dark Ages. And actually what's interesting is the lecture that you guys experience in class whenever a teacher teaches you actually comes from the Latin root meaning to read. And what would happen is the professor would read from the book that the university has, the one copy, because there might only be one copy in the whole world of whatever the text is, and all of the students would sit and write everything that he's reading so that they can get the information out of it. Interesting little tidbit. And eyeglasses, interestingly enough, because if you're going to be reading but you can't see very well, you need some way of seeing. So we see the unity begin kind of early on in the Dark Ages, starting in the 500s, but then really the 700s is where it gets interesting, where Clovis, the king of the Franks, unites them under his rule, and he was the one that really erased the last signs of Rome, fought other German tribes, and brought unity. He also brought Christianity, which is something that's important because what we see later on with Charles Martel, it becomes Christian Europe versus Muslim, the Muslim Caliphate. So Charles Martel, really cool, named Charles the Hammer, has his claim to fame in 732 at the Battle of Tours, which you can see, there's Mecca and Medina. The Islamic Caliphate expanded, as you've already seen, with chapters 6, 7, and 8, with the Umayyad, the Abbasids, and all that. The Byzantine kind of smack in the middle, having its difficulties, as we've discussed already with chapter 9. But the Muslim Empire from 632 spread all the way up to where it was knocking on Europe's door here at Tours in 732. So in 100 years, expanded across all of North Africa up into Spain. It was Charles Martel who defeated the Moors from this place, which Morocco now, M-O-O-R-S, were the Moors, were defeated at the Battle of Tours, thus keeping Europe north of the Pyrenees Christian and then south of the Pyrenees Muslim. Charlemagne is a very valuable person to talk about. His name means Charles the Great. Charlemagne means Charles the Great. And he's most remembered because he was very active, very intelligent, and very powerful. And I would recommend you pause the video at this point so you can copy this stuff down, probably on the Ian side of your notebook, just to draw this chart. You do need to know these things. Okay, you're unpaused now. So, the thing that we need to know about Charlemagne is the Holy Roman Empire. People wanted the Roman Empire back. Even hundreds of years after its death, they wanted it back. And so he was crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800. So it's a very interesting development. Let's see here. Okay, sorry for that little interruption there. Next, what we see is, as we get into the later Middle Ages, the early Middle and the High Middle Ages, we see the retraction phase end and the reaction phase begin. People have found some stability, especially once we have Charlemagne with the Holy Roman Empire and providing that unity and strength. We start to see the population increase. some of the technological advances, like what you should have looked up from farming previously. The three-field crop rotation, they can support a larger population, and that means you need bigger places for people to live. So towns begin to grow. Once you have a lot of people living in the same place, you're going to naturally have trade. What we see is an interesting way that they handle it is all of the blacksmiths or all of the cobblers or all of the candle makers or whatever in a town form guilds. And this is trade guilds are groups of artisans and merchants looking to protect their business. Anybody that comes to town has to get permission from the guild to be able to do business in that particular area. The Hanseatic League is kind of a guild on a larger scale. It's a union of a lot of different kingdoms and countries trying to facilitate trade, trying to make it easier for them to trade between themselves. We see learning, as I've already pointed out, universities started, and what's interesting is that monasteries were actually centers of learning. They weren't just places where monks would go and pray and live the monastic life. They were actually educational facilities for the surrounding areas. So they would come, since all they had to do all day was pray and read and learn, they would come up with new farming methods and new building methods, and they would teach some of the village townspeople close by. But they would also preserve knowledge in this thing called scriptoria. What you see happening here is perhaps this monk has the only copy of a text that had been preserved. What he's doing is copying it word for word, page by page, making another copy. They didn't have printing presses. They certainly didn't have Xeroxes. So the monks would preserve them by making handwritten copies. This is also where we see the illuminated manuscripts, the really cool ones where they have gold paint with very intricate drawings and paintings, and sometimes very interesting ones, rather vulgar if you look at some of them. But this scriptoria preserved knowledge. We see the Gothic culture, and this is something that's well associated with the Middle Ages, as the architecture tries to reach for heaven, that life on earth is so horrible because of short life, disease, invasion, and so on. You have the structure and the safety and the security and stability of the religion, so people would turn to faith, and the faith starts to reflect a notion that life on earth is terrible, we can't wait to get to heaven. So even the architecture looks like it's trying to reach away from the earth and reach up towards heaven, called Gothic architecture. We see literary advancements. Let's pour one out for the homie because Heath Ledger's dead, but The Knight's Tale is actually one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And so it's pretty interesting. If you have seen that movie, you have a little connection to Chaucer. Beowulf is another interesting one. Unfortunately, Hollywood generally messes up history. But Chaucer wrote in the vernacular, which is everyday language, the vocabulary term you should know. This meant that everyday people, instead of monks or priests or aristocrats and kings, everyday people could learn to read and could have entertainment. We see science developing. There's various achievements and advances in science, including using cathedrals as observatories, interestingly. And printing does begin towards the end of this time period. But Johannes Gutenberg is most famous for his 1455 invention or adaptation of the printing press. And trade and banking. Of course, you have guilds, you have trade, you have the Hanseatic League. You've got to be able to have money change hands. Now, we also see the concept of limited government come out of this. If you've seen, unfortunately, I have Hollywood to use as an example again, the most recent Robin Hood movie, the bad guy in that is King John, who is the bad guy in the Middle Ages, leading to the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, in 1215. This limited the power of the king. It meant the king could not have unlimited power. He had to ask for the permission of the people he was governing to do certain things. And this is the first time in history that we see a document where the people limit the power of the government. Our government reflects that, where our government governs by the consent of the governed. That if we don't want something to happen, it shouldn't, because the government must listen to its citizens. It's where Parliament gains a lot of power in this Magna Carta, and they demand that the king ask them for permission before he do certain things, sort of like increasing taxes. We see in religion, because it is such a backbone of society, religion is still important, but there's also a scientific component to it, and that's where we see the development of scholasticism, which is the blending of faith and reason. Most famous scholastic was Thomas Aquinas, who was a very smart man living around the 1200s, and he became what's known as a doctor of the Catholic Church because of the work that he did. He was very smart and very well read. And of course we have witches, but you can watch that on your own. Very funny, another clip from Monty Python. Now the Crusades we've already mentioned with the battles. We mentioned chapters 6 through 8, the Islamic chapters. We also mentioned it with chapter 9 in the Byzantine. But now what we need to see here is that it